Thank you. Good evening. It's July 20th, 2020, and this is the Policy Committee meeting of the Board of Education in Guilford, Connecticut. We will get right to it, and we will discuss what is on the agenda tonight. I'm going to actually let Dr. Freeman, you can speak to, we're discussing the language regarding the policy pertaining to mascots. And so if you'd like to review kind of the revisions we made and then some new language that you were going to propose to us.
Yep, I'm happy to. And I can go ahead and share my screen and I'll show you what we are talking about here, which will also benefit the community at large. Can you guys see the language that we're talking about?
Yes.
Yep.
So at our last meeting, we had discussed some draft policy language and we had made some minor modifications to that language, and that is represented by this first block of text that is not in bold type. This is where we had ended after our conversations. This language was brought to you by Mr. Bowden and I. We had drafted this. What it does in large part is it makes clear that we believe that moving forward, that students at a school should have significant voice in the adoption of any mascot at that level. Secondly, it makes clear that mascots should not be human or human societies or human cultures, that in large part they would tend to be animal or mythical, and that at this point, we currently have 7 individual school mascots, but we wanted to make clear that this policy is not requiring that practice. At the end of that meeting, the committee members asked that we reach out to Mr. Kazin. Mr. Kazin previously has been a member of this board. He has been a member of this subcommittee, and he is a practicing attorney who happens to have a lot of experience in the area of policy language. Gary reached out, did some research, like Mr. Bowden and I was unable to find any local Connecticut policies of this nature, did refer us back to our own policy around the naming of schools or school locations, which I believe we had discussed last year as last week as the closest analog that we have, but did find some in other school systems. In our conversation, Gary made 2 important points. One, that we should broaden the policy in the naming. He felt that it was more important not to have a policy that was specific about the identification or naming of mascots, but rather one that addressed school symbols. And then secondly, Gary simply reminded us that when it comes to policy, fewer words is better. And so Gary's revision of the policy language is what you see in bold at the bottom of the page. We've also looked at our policy book, and we would suggest that this policy be entered as policy 1349. This would put it in the community section and would drop it immediately following the policy that does speak to the naming of school buildings or school facilities. This language, while it is shorter than what we had drafted last week, does hit those important components. So specifically, school symbol means all mascots, nicknames, icons, and descriptors, including symbols, banners, flags, pennants, or similar identifiers. The board prohibits the use of any race or ethnic group as a school symbol. The board recognizes the value of a school symbol to school spirit and morale. The decision to adopt or change a school symbol shall be made at the individual school level in conjunction with the school community and student body. And finally, this policy does not require any individual school to have a school symbol. So again, at this time, I think that both versions hit the important points. I think that Mr. Kazin was really helpful, and I'm glad we reached out to him. And that's the update. You do have a quorum of this committee present here tonight. So if you chose to do so, this group could make a recommendation that we move either version or a revised version of this policy onto the full board for consideration and then possible action.
Yeah, I'm really glad Gary took a look at this because his simplification of it, I really I like this version a lot better. Not to take anything away, but it takes what you did, simplifies it, and breaks it down pretty straightforward.
I absolutely agree.
Maura, you're muted.
Just reading it over again. So essentially we're going to abandon the mascot as the preliminary or the primary focus of the policy and shift more to a symbol nomenclature. And so I'm just looking, including symbols, banners, flags, pennants, or similar identifiers. So including uniforms, I'm assuming, but we don't have to call that out. Okay.
Yep,
Okay.
that would absolutely include what we put on a uniform. I would go so far as to suggest that it would include whether or not, if at some point we were to commission a costumed character to appear at games, it would fall under this policy.
Okay.
In this way. And this policy does not in any way preclude us, as we talked about, moving forward, putting together either from the administrative level, putting out a practice or a list of guidance as to how we do this, or at the board level from creating regulations moving forward. You know, the board could always create regulations that were attached to this policy, or the administration could create a protocol that was attached to this policy. Those don't exist with every policy we have, but if we felt that it was important to do so, we could do so at a later date.
Right, because we talked about that last week, kind of seeing how this process goes, and if we feel like we need to build upon this policy, we can.
Exactly right. And in one word, he addressed Kristen's concern about what about changing. He just was able to address that by putting in the word to adopt or change. Right, I was torturing myself over a full sentence about how to do that, and it seems law school does have a value.
Yeah.
Brief and to the point. So I guess my only other question is, he only says race or ethnic group. So that's, I mean, I'm fine with that, but we talked about last week, you know, what do we say?
I'll read it here. It's not limited to representations, animals, mythical creatures, inanimate objects, or colors. In no case shall a mascot be an individual human being, a group of human beings, a race or of human beings, or specific creature of human society.
Right. So he's just condensing it to race or ethnic group. He's not. Yep. Like okay. All right.
And quite honestly, I mean, Gary went right back to the whole conversation, the communications we had received from the community, the discussion we had with the folks from Acamont and the Dowd Foundation. And I think we talked about the fact that some school mascots can, right? The Patriots are in fact. So he said, what are we worried about? What are we concerned about? Where did the offense come from?
Right.
It was because it was rape. And so he again took us right back. Now that also, you know, it sort of limited that side of the equation, but it also addressed the concerns that, John, I think you expressed, that we don't need a list of things that will limit us in the future of what the possibilities are. It just says what it won't be, and it really focused on the core of that component.
Yeah.
May I ask a question? My apologies, because I was not unable to be at the meeting last week. Does this cover something like the Chiefs or the Warriors? Do we feel like this sufficiently covers those types of possibilities? I guess I'm using those two examples because I think they are related to a racial group, but they don't. I think you get, they're a little less directly related. And is there a concern of the policy committee about that or not?
I think the issue that I get into is, you know, is specific to, you know, Chiefs is a good example, is, you know, how do you include something like that in verbiage of something you want to avoid, you know, but besides just blanketing it and saying race or ethnic group? You know, I would say it falls under that, but then, you know, the list could go on and on about what we're trying to limit as it pertains to ethnic groups or races. So, you know, my fear is that, you know, similar to what you're saying, Katie, I just don't think we're ever going to come up with a concise enough list to be able to list everything we don't want to include unless we actually list it out.
Well, maybe it's something as simple as, and I know this, I don't want to go over it, take away from Gary's language, but the board prohibits use of any race or the use of or reference to, I don't know, any race or ethnic group, because I get Katie's point with the Warriors and the Chiefs and even the Redmen, right? It's a reference to it, but it's not a blatant. I know we can get in the weeds about this, and I agree with you, like the simpler the better.
I do like the the reference verbiage.
The use or reference of any, I don't know, the use or reference to any race or ethnic group as a school symbol.
That's all you'd
I don't
really
know if that
need to add
covers
is
it.
or reference would do it.
Yeah. Yeah, the use or reference to any race or ethnic. I mean, I'd love to hear people's thoughts. It's just an idea, but it might cover that. And so,
I think it does shield it quite a bit. Yeah, I like that.
You could certainly make the point that, that the chief or the warrior is a reference to, and
Yep.
right. And so, yep, I
Mhm.
think that does broaden it a little bit.
Katie, I'm curious to hear what you think, given that you brought
No,
that. good point up.
I think that's right. I mean, I certainly, I hear your points, and I have, having served on the policy committee for many years with Gary, always a gift, his advice to use fewer words. And I do think reference definitely expands the meaning in an important way. So.
Okay. Right, good.
And then again, the only other thing I'd remind the board of before moving forward is that I do just want to name for the board that the high school is going through a process that does involve the community and privileged student voice in identifying. Now, I don't see any need to stop that. The fact we do lots of things in the absence of policy, but I do want to call out that I met with Principal Chaff today, and the process they are following would, they're clear that they would be meeting the expectations of this policy. I don't see anything that we're considering in this policy that Principal Chaff is not aware of or including in her process moving forward.
Very good.
Okay, good. So are there any other, is there anything else you want to add to it? Or is there anything else any other committee members want to point out, or before we?
No, I could say something. I think the additional verbiage we just put in is great. My question is, if a student or if this policy is violated by non-sanctioned materials, like there's stuff going around now in our community where certain people are very adamant that they want to be labeled as an Indian or Guilford Indians for life. If they were to violate this policy as a student on our grounds, is there going to be like any repercussions? Should the policy include any type of repercussions if it wasn't being followed? I don't know. Is that something that we put in our policy handbook that way?
Yeah. So, Joe, I don't think that would land here. That would land under disciplinary or dress code policy. And in my opinion, right now, we've got 70 years worth of spirit wear and Guilford High School paraphernalia and wear that says Indians on it. It is not our expectation that we are going to disallow students from wearing their vintage garb to school.
Mm-hmm.
If for any reason, students were being disruptive. I mean, let's say that spectators at a football game came to the event wearing native costumes or in red face, then that would be responded to under the dress code or disruptive behavioral policies. This policy will guide in what the high school identifies as their next mascot. And I think for a period of time, there will be both the new gear and the old gear. And as long as people are wearing that old gear respectfully and not causing a disruption, we have no intention of asking people to turn in their vintage high school spirit wear. It would just need to be worn or displayed in such a way so as to be respectful and not cause a disturbance or disruption to any event that they were attending. I don't know if I answered. Did that answer the question?
Yes, thank you. I'm good. Thank you.
Paul, there's obviously questions in the community about uniforms.
Yep.
And, we put this policy in place in the next few weeks, and then, sports, hopefully some of our sports can proceed in the fall. And are we expecting them to abide by this new policy in terms of uniform purchases, you know, from, how are we going to manage that? I guess my question.
Oh, absolutely. So there may be a period of transition, but I'm working on scheduling a meeting with Mr. Jarvis, the athletic director. But one, we have no intention of putting students on a field with a uniform that reads Indians from this day forward, because that is no longer our mascot. We may have to work to phase in new uniform purchases. We may not necessarily have uniforms that have a new mascot on them for the new teams come September, but we may have uniforms that have, the generic Guilford on them. We will need to work with that moving forward. We have begun around the high school to address areas like the press box and the gym floor that specifically had the name Indians painted in it, and we're removing that labeling. So kind of two phases. One would be making sure that we are no longer presenting ourselves as the Indians, and then two would be rebranding under a new name or a new symbol, and that piece might be slower in coming.
Okay, thank you. Just taking my notes here. So I guess that was just my concern with the uniforms, but if you're communicating with Jake, then it'll be filtered down to the groups that need to know. Okay, so is there anything else anybody wants to contribute to this topic? Because it is our one item on the agenda tonight.
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then I would assume that we would then be comfortable, and again, speak up if not, as a policy committee, moving forward, policy number 1349, school symbol, to the general board for a vote. So we need to vote to move it forward.
We need a motion for that, Moira?
Yes.
Okay, I'll move to accept that then.
Have a second?
So moved. Second.
Thank you. Great. So we as a policy committee will move forward policy number 1349, school symbol, to the General Board of Education, and hopefully for our next meeting for a full vote of the board.
And just a reminder that generally policy takes 2 full meetings. It's there in the first item to receive, the first meeting to receive and discuss, and then we would ask for a vote at the following meeting. And I would suggest that I don't see any reason to rush this. I would assume that we'd want to allow this to take that time so that community members would have an opportunity to comment if they choose to do so.
Sure. But in conjunction, you'll be coordinating with Jake, because there's like funds involved. So, I don't want to have things backtrack on him. So, okay, great. All right.
Yep.
So is there any other business that anybody would like to bring up?
No.
All right, then I guess we are concluded for tonight's policy committee meeting. Thanks, everybody. Get a little time before the next meeting, and you will make sure that's on the next agenda for a general meeting, which will be in 1 week.
Probably going
right?
to be the first. Yep. The next
Okay.
meeting will be the August meeting.
All right.
Thank you all very
Great.
much.
All right, thank you,
Okay, thanks
everybody.
much.
See you in a little bit.
We'll see you at 7. And thanks, Bruce.
Okay.
You're welcome, Paul. We'll see you in a little bit.
We'll see you at 7.
Yep, thanks. Bye.